Research and analysis.
Research and analysis, I'm sorry. He's are you behind the quarterly report?
Yes.
Yeah. Every quarter, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction has to put out a report. It's mandated by Congress, and they're quite large. They have these large data calls and all of that. Well, Joe's involved in as a writer and a researcher doing that. But Gene is here to speak to us again. He's been here several times, and he's gone to other schools like ours, and he's brought the word about the good work of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. I've asked you to look at the article. John Sopko is the IG, if you will, for it, and Gene is his right-hand man, kind of the operational aspects of it, and really runs the operations of the whole organization. Gene has 38 years of experience with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Full disclosure, I worked for Gene for a number of years. I still work for Gene with a special, so we have a linkage there, but I'm really pleased that that linkage allows him to come in here. He's testified before Congress 50 times. He's been on 60 Minutes, been on Al Jazeera, wasn't it? You were interviewed? Yeah. You know, he's been to Afghanistan a number of times, done a lot of international work throughout his whole career. Really a guy that has looked at proposals and projects and policies, and from an analytical aspect. He's a great analyst and a great public policy person. So I'm really pleased to have you here, and he'll be talking about the experience of SIGAR in Afghanistan, and linking that, I think, directly, because I read your speech, to our work in Uganda, but also I think you'll see the linkages here as well. So, Gene, please.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. As Tom said, we go way back, and you're actually very lucky to have him as a professor, because he's a very knowledgeable guy, as well as a very nice guy.
Would that help, Alex?
Yes.
Sorry.
I'm pleased to be here today. It's encouraging to see all of you in this room, because you will be the future policymakers or leaders of tomorrow. And as Tom said, I have close to 40 years, more experience, and you know, eventually Tom and I will go away, and you people will replace us. So it's important that you learn from our experiences that we can share from you going on when you face your challenges. So I understand that the project you're working on is focused on Uganda. Is that correct? And despite the obvious geographical and cultural differences, I think you'll find that Afghanistan can offer several lessons to inform your work. Although Afghanistan and Uganda are more than 3,000 miles apart, they share some key data points. Transparency International's Corruption Perception Survey places Afghanistan near the bottom of the list of countries, 172nd out of 174, just edging out Sudan, North Korea, and Somalia for the title of the most corrupt nation. Uganda is slightly less corrupt at 142, more corrupt than Iran, but less corrupt than Kenya. But where the two countries are even more alike is in their levels of poverty. According to the World Bank, Afghanistan's gross national income per capita in 2014 was $670, just under Uganda's 2014 per capita GNP of $680. However, as Uganda's GDP growth seems to be growing, Afghanistan's is not, because it has been artificially inflated from years of massive international assistance. And it is stagnant and will likely fall if or when the foreign money that's in there now dries up. Donor grants make up 80% of its national budget. To be clear, Afghanistan's government cannot afford to sustain itself and will continue to rely on foreign assistance into the foreseeable future if it is to survive at all. And today's news is not real good on Afghanistan. Taliban have captured one of the largest cities, and hopefully we'll get beat back out of there.
Gene, if you go just a little bit this way, then you won't be in the projector light.
You keep going.
That's good.
Is that better?
I'm not going to do this over again.
No. I wanted to get into the filming of it, you see, or cameo.
We can edit that out.
Yeah.
For those of you that are unfamiliar with Cigar, let me start by giving you a brief overview of who we are and what we do. Cigar was created by Congress in 2008 to provide independent and objective oversight of the U.S. reconstruction effort in Afghanistan. So we were already late getting started since money, troops were in Afghanistan starting in 2002. But better late than never for the Congress, I guess. Our agency is comprised of auditors, investigators, inspectors, and other professionals committed to ensuring that taxpayer funds are protected from fraud, waste, and abuse. We publish audit and inspection reports that delve into the details of U.S.-funded projects and programs in Afghanistan. And we release a quarterly report compiling the most current information from all of the agencies operating in Afghanistan. This report serves as the most comprehensive assessment of the U.S.-funded reconstruction effort. It's available online, as all our reports are, and it can be used as a resource by anyone and everyone who has an interest in Afghanistan, or reconstruction in general, for that matter. In fact, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani told us that he reads our reports cover to cover, and when we met with him, he actually came in to the room with one of our quarterly reports, dog-eared and tags sticking out of it. So at least there's one person we know who reads this report. Because we have a specific mission-driven purpose, our agency is temporary. We will sunset when reconstruction funds dip below $250 million in unexpended funds. And that's unusual for a federal agency to go out of business, but we will eventually. For the time being, however, the agency isn't at risk of going out of business because, as our recent quarterly showed, to date, Congress has appropriated nearly $110 billion for reconstruction in Afghanistan, and there's about $12 billion remaining to be spent. In addition, the President has pledged $5 to $6 billion a year for the next 10 years to keep the Afghan National Defense Forces intact. Now let me take a moment to conceptualize this amount. The reconstruction effort in Afghanistan has become the most costly reconstruction effort ever undertaken by the United States. It's an astounding amount of money, particularly when you stack it up next to countries that received reconstruction funding after World War II under the Marshall Plan. Afghanistan has received more in inflation-adjusted dollars than all of the European countries, I think there were 16 of them, that we helped after World War II. This funding is being used to achieve a wide range of reconstruction goals. Above all, it's paying to build and train the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. But it is also being spent to implement programs to promote good governance, conduct developmental assistance, and engage in counter-narcotics and anti-corruption efforts. Your tax dollars are building weapons for Afghan soldiers and building schools for Afghan children. And perhaps most importantly, they're training ministry officials to someday, we hope, be able to provide these types of necessary government services independent of assistance. This complex work is conducted by multiple agencies, but primarily by DoD, State Department, and U.S. Agency for International Development. Now that's where Cigar comes in, to figure out exactly how effectively this money is being spent. We are the eyes and ears of the Congress on the ground in Afghanistan. Cigar is the only oversight agency focused solely on Afghanistan. Unlike most other inspector generals, we have the ability to look at the work of multiple agencies at once. In a conflict zone like Afghanistan, federal agencies work together to tackle key problems. And we have multi-jurisdictional authority to look at all the agencies involved. We can look at state, DoD, USAID, Department of Transportation, Department of Agriculture. We can look at all of those agencies. And generally, an Inspector General is located in one agency and can only look at its own agency. Now, Cigar's work makes a substantial financial impact on the reconstruction effort. Since 2008, Cigar has identified over $1.6 billion in savings, representing a return of almost $8 for every dollar appropriated for Cigar. Our investigators have saved the U.S. government more than $550 million, and forfeitures, fines, and restitution resulting from criminal investigations currently total over $18 million. In addition, SIGAR's investigative work has led to the conviction of over 80 persons, 64 of whom have been sentenced. Unfortunately, many of those are our military folks. During the first quarter of fiscal year 2015, SIGAR received a record $53.7 million for the U.S. Government from civil settlements, and that nearly pays for our operating budget, which is about $57 million. Now, these significant results are a credit to our staff. SIGAR employs the largest oversight presence in Afghanistan, and most of the deployed staff in Afghanistan served for 2 years, providing a stable base of knowledge to the oversight community. Our personnel from the agency's headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, travel to Afghanistan on a temporary duty basis, ranging from 2 to 8 weeks, to conduct audit, inspection, and investigative work alongside our Afghan-based colleagues. But what is SIGAR looking at in Afghanistan, and what have we learned that may shed some light on the work all of you will be doing in the future? So I want to first talk about the need for evidence-based policymaking. As students of foreign affairs, international security, and public policy, many of you will one day be policy advisors or even policymakers. It is with that in mind that I want to speak with you about the concept known as evidence-based policymaking. It is actually a very simple idea. Evidence-based policymaking is the notion that policymakers can achieve substantially better results by using rigorous evidence to inform decisions. It makes sense that decisions based upon the best possible information might be better than decisions that are not. And we've seen a lot of decisions that are not based on evidence. To help agencies do this, SIGAR developed a list of 7 questions for policymakers considering aid projects for another country. If these questions are asked by the agencies before we spend $1 of aid, our assistance will be far more effective. I can guarantee you this. The 7 questions are, and don't worry about writing them down, they'll be on the last slide. 1, does the project or program make a clear and identifiable contribution to our national interest or strategic objectives? If it doesn't, why are we there? Our primary reason for being in Afghanistan was to get Al-Qaeda and to prevent Afghanistan from being a terrorist haven again in the future. Everything we do should be striving towards that. Even the reconstruction effort is striving towards that. Number 2, does the recipient country want the project and need it? Now, you might think that's a really simple question, but we have spent so much money in Afghanistan building so much stuff that the Afghans don't want, don't need, can't use, can't sustain. So we're saying, from this point on, ask them if they want it. Ask them if they need it before we spend hundreds of millions of dollars building schools, hospitals, or whatever they don't want or need or can't sustain. 3rd, has the project been coordinated with other U.S. agencies, with the recipient government, and with other international donors? 4, do security conditions permit effective implementation and oversight? Much of what's been built so far, we can't provide oversight over because it's in Taliban land. And so millions of dollars of schools, hospitals, we don't know if they're functioning, we don't know how they're being used. Security is prime. 5th, does the project have adequate safeguards to detect, deter, and mitigate corruption? 6th, does the recipient government have the financial resources, technical capacity, and political will to sustain the project? And finally, 7, have implementing agencies established meaningful, measurable metrics for determining successful program outcomes? When dealing with the massive Afghanistan reconstruction effort, one might rightly surmise that these questions are all important in determining the success or failure of the U.S. mission to build a secure and stable Afghanistan. We ask agency decision makers to consider these questions because they provide a guideline to whether a program will succeed or fail. And simply put, the success or failure of a given intervention is vital to future strategic planning, allocation of resources, and in short, policymaking. The bottom line is that if you don't have a means of knowing whether or not your programs are succeeding, the policymaker's job just became that much more difficult. Now, I'm not saying that the major players in the reconstruction mission, DoD, state, USAID, never set baselines or other performance metrics to assess their programs. What I am saying is that greater scrutiny needs to be exercised along every step of the project management cycle, from selecting appropriate baselines to measuring and monitoring data against these starting points, and finally in the interpretation of the results. Chances are, if we at SIGAR have issued a report on a project, there was a fundamental breakdown in one of those steps along the way. So perhaps it becomes incumbent upon me to explain how to avoid such occurrences in the future. First, before even considering whether to set a baseline for a given project, it is a worthwhile exercise to stop and think about what it is you're trying to achieve. What is your end goal, or as you say, terms it, what is your theory of change? One Congressional Research Service report written on the subject of evaluating foreign aid notes that a key problem in measuring aid effectiveness is that aid provided for development objectives is often conflated with aid provided for political and security purposes. We see this all the time in Afghanistan. The general assumption, no matter which agency is providing the assistance, is that the bar is so low that any infusion of funding or technical expertise will improve the status quo. In other words, the initial objective doesn't need to be precise because the intervention will surely do some good in some area. While that may be true in some cases, especially in the early days, just after the Taliban were removed from power, we must hold ourselves to a higher standard when tens of billions of taxpayers' dollars and the sacrifice of so many lives hang in the balance. We must demand precision, and we must never confuse outputs for outcomes. Now that brings me to my next point. The baselines that you choose inevitably become the standards by which you, and eventually others, will judge your work. So set realistic, measurable standards. And in social science that can be tricky. There's often little to go on in terms of determining reasonable standards. And in many cases, we must make an educated guess based upon imperfect information. In a conflict-affected environment such as Afghanistan, this challenge is amplified. That said, perhaps constructing buildings to U.S. standards across the board in such an environment might be unwise, especially if we expect the Afghans to maintain and sustain what we give them. I am certainly not saying that the infrastructure we build for them should be inferior in any way. What I am saying is that standards vary widely from country to country, region to region, and when setting a baseline standard, one should be cognizant of the operating environment. And I can give you an example of what I'm talking about. We built a facility for the military in Afghanistan to Western standards, as we usually do, not taking in consideration Afghan standards or what they wanted or what they needed. So we put into this facility an oven that you might have in your own homes. It looked like a regular Sears bought oven. And of course, there's all kinds of questions along how you're going to power this thing. Most of this stuff runs on diesel-generated fuel. The Afghans ripped out the oven, threw it away, scrapped it, and put a wood-burning stove in there, because that's how they cook their food. They cook it over hot coals. They don't use an oven. And this happened many, many times. We would put this equipment in that we think, you know, that's what we use here in our kitchens. Well, this is in Kansas. This is Afghanistan. And they don't use the same things or want the same things we need. We could have saved probably billions of dollars if we listened to what they wanted and what they needed. In general, policy decisions must be made based upon honestly measured results. And this is where the evidence-based policymaking term comes in. If after 13 years and so much blood and treasure invested in Afghanistan, we cannot be honest with ourselves about our successes and failures, we are not only leaving the Afghans in a precarious position, but also putting our entire mission there at risk. Now, I have a few examples that you may find useful for your work. And when you consider your project, I would recommend that you first start off with clear objectives. Now I'm going to talk about a program called SERP. I want to talk about this important program in Afghanistan, and it highlights the issues I just discussed. The SERP stands for the Department of Defense's Commander's Emergency Response Program. The program really highlights the importance of 2 of the 7 questions. Does the project or program make a clear and identifiable contribution to our national interests or strategic objectives? And have implementing agencies established meaningful, measurable metrics for determining successful program outcomes? Between November 2003 and June 2004, Congress appropriated about $3.7 billion for SERP, which was designed to help U.S. commanders in Afghanistan respond to urgent humanitarian relief and reconstruction requirements. Congress gave DoD broad authority to spend appropriated funds, which were not bound by procurement laws or federal procurement regulations. SERP funding was intended for small projects costing less than $500,000 each. Projects which cost more than $1 million were permitted, but they require approval from the commander of U.S. Central Command. A member of Congress once described the program to me as, quote, well-intentioned walking around money, end quote. Another way of putting it is that SERP was a way for U.S. commanders to pay village elders in exchange for not getting their troops shot at. So when the military would go into a village, they would go to a village elder and they'd say, what do you need? You need a hospital, you need a gym, you need a school, what do you need? You need a clinic? And we take out a wad of cash and say, here's $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, whatever. Build your clinic, build your school, don't shoot at my troops, don't kill us. And that's basically a lot of what SERP was used for. SERP funds were used to implement projects throughout Afghanistan, with a significant portion of these funds used where the insurgency was the strongest. Projects ran the gamut from infrastructure and agriculture to healthcare, education, and economic development. According to SERP's authorizing legislation, as well as DoD's standard operating procedures for the program, SERP's program or purpose was to enable U.S. military commanders to respond to urgent humanitarian relief and reconstruction requirements in order to immediately assist the Afghan people. But if you think about it, humanitarian relief and reconstruction is not really an objective in and of itself. Would you say that its objective is to provide foreign aid? No. Providing aid is what you say does, but it does so to further the U.S. foreign policy and national security objectives. Incredibly, for the first 9 years of SERP's existence, I have not been able to find a single clearly articulated mention of the program's true objectives in any official document beyond the generic inputs of, quote, humanitarian relief and reconstruction, end quote. In 2012, SERP guidance finally explicitly stated desired effects of the program in 2 main thematic categories: counterinsurgency and economic development. Prior to this, SERP guidance listed only categories of projects such as education, health, agriculture, and others, but did not identify explicit goals of the program itself. Later guidance managed to almost completely eliminate the counterinsurgency objectives. The introduction of this same guidance states that commanders should be executing projects resulting in measurable effects that support counterinsurgency objectives. So according to DoD, commanders should execute projects which can be measured according to objectives that are not clearly stated. And we wonder why there is confusion about SERP's effectiveness, and there is. When you have such a diversity of goals, some implicit, some explicit, and some of which blatantly contradict each other, it becomes impossible to tell which goal dominates, and for oversight bodies, the goal for which people should be held accountable. Part of the problem is the baseline assumption, without any actual grounding in data, that the program is helping to begin with. To commanders, the degree to which it is helping doesn't really matter as long as it's helping win hearts and minds for their troops. The military is not really in the business of calculating return on investment for taxpayer funding. It is in the business of winning engagements and doing so with the fewest number of casualties. As a Marine general told me, he says, we don't reconstruct things, we deconstruct things. We don't do reconstruction very well. Yet DoD had billions of dollars to do just that. Because this program was initially designed without explicitly stating objectives and stringent performance metrics, it largely lends itself to anecdotal evidence by small unit commanders who view the program as another tool in their tactical kit, much like a weapon system or other force multiplier. Therefore, it should surprise no one that the sustainability of CERP funding schools have been singled out because they are literally crumbling and falling apart, or that CERP-funded hospitals actually become unsafe because their electrical and water supply systems fail. The overarching objective was never to build a school or hospital, staff it, supply it, and otherwise maintain it in order to improve education or health in Afghanistan. The goal was to win a war, and to do so at the lowest human and material cost possible. So what about the anecdotal evidence about CERP successes? How does it save the lives of troops, build trust where it was lacking, and further the security mission in Afghanistan? Perhaps it has, but we can't verify that. No one can. More importantly, I can't quantify how many lives CERP have saved and to what extent the program furthered our security objectives. That type of attribution will be difficult to ascertain under great conditions. But when I can't even tell what the program's basic objectives were, I certainly can't tell you whether it's succeeding or not. Another example I want to talk to you about has to do with sustainability. It is important to make sure that a project is sustainable. Now I'm going to talk to you about, we call it the G222 example. And this example highlights the importance of another question on the list. Does the recipient government have the financial resources, technical capacity, and political will to sustain it? In December 2013, we initiated a review of the DoD's expenditures of nearly $500 million for 20 G222 aircraft for the Afghan Air Force. This was an attempt to provide the Afghans with an off-the-shelf medium airlift capability. Makes sense, right? But despite spending nearly $500 million, the aircraft flew only 234 hours because of major defects in the planes. In fact, pilots we talked to called them death traps. The G222 program apparently ended in March 2013 after experiencing continuous and severe operational difficulties, including a lack of spare parts. It was brought to our attention that the 16 G222s that were in Kabul, 4 were in Germany, were eventually scrapped by the Defense Logistics Agency at a cost to the U.S. taxpayer of $188,000. So we bought these planes for $500 million, and we scrapped them for $188,000, and they flew 234 hours. An Afghan construction company paid approximately 6 cents a pound for the scrap planes, which came to a total of $32,000. So for almost a $500 million investment, you, the U.S. taxpayer, got $32,000 in return. Planes never flew, and we still need to buy them a small aircraft, airlift capability. Now, as a taxpayer, it's hard not to be offended by this sort of wasteful spending. Why did this happen? As you might expect, poor planning was at the heart of this. In the case of these aircraft, DoD did not adequately plan for securing the spare parts the Afghans would need to keep these planes flying. Moreover, some of the most critical spare parts were no longer available for these aircraft. And as it turned out, the Afghan Air Force had other aircraft available to them to meet their requirement. So as we've seen, it becomes really difficult for SIGAR to assess reconstruction projects and programs if agencies don't set clear criteria or project management standards. An equally frustrating and unbelievably baffling occurrence is when the agencies do not take the time to think about appropriate standards for their projects. And I'll give you another example, the Gardez Hospital. A few years back, USAID spent almost $15 million to build a hospital in Gardez, the provincial capital of Paktika province. The effort was just one small part of a $57 million contract awarded to build health and education facilities throughout Afghanistan, which would then be turned over to the Afghans to operate. The hospital hit a few snags in the building process, and it was delayed for several months. But other than that, it was a solidly built structure that ended up being 12 times larger than the previous hospital in Gardez. A headline that should have meant a huge increase in local healthcare capacity. There was just one problem. USAID did not fully assess the Afghan Ministries of Public Health's ability to operate and maintain the hospital once it was completed. So there were not enough doctors to staff the hospital, there were not enough nurses to help the doctors, and there were not enough patients to fill this hospital. So about 2 of the rooms of this enormous hospital have been used, the rest of it sits empty. In the end, USAID managed to increase the cost for the Afghans to operate the hospital in Gardez by a factor of 5. The original hospital they had an operational cost, including fuel for its generators, of $611,000 per year. The hospital we built for them cost $3.2 million per year just for the fuel to operate. The Afghans can't afford it. It won't be sustained, and it is a waste of money. I wish I could say this is an isolated incident, but this sort of thing happens all the time. We at SIGAR are always being accused of only issuing negative reports and not reporting on the positive aspects of reconstruction. It's the agency's mantra. Well, 2 years ago we asked the agencies, you know what, okay, you're right, all we report on is negative stuff. And we've looked for some positive stuff. You give us your top 10 success stories. DOD, state, USAID. Give us your success stories. Tell us how you measured them to be a success. And we will look at that and either agree or disagree with it. And they came back and said, well, look, we really can't do that because we don't rate our programs. But in general, healthcare is better, women's issues are better, security is better. And we went back, no, yeah, we know all that heavy talk. What programs that you're implementing actually work? And how do you measure that? Well, they never answered us. It's been over 2 years, going on 3 years. So if you can't answer that question, how do you prioritize your programs? How do you come up with a budget? How do you convince Congress what you're doing is important and needed? You can't even tell me what your 10 most important programs are. So that's where we still sit today with that. We keep asking them for their 10. It's almost a ritual now, but they won't fess up. Now, if you're not already depressed enough, I want to mention one final example. And this one deals with gender issues in a program called Promoting Gender Equity in National Priority Programs, or PROMOTE for short. PROMOTE is a 5-year, $416 million program that is being touted as USAID's largest women's empowerment program in the world. The goal of this program is to boost Afghan female participation in the economy, help women gain practical business skills, and increase the number of women in the Afghan government. All laudable goals. It remains unclear, however, the extent to which USAID will be able to implement, monitor, and assess the impact of PROMOTE and the extent to which the program will achieve its overall goal. Based on what I know about your studies in this class, I think the example of PROMOTE will speak directly to the concerns that exist about establishing effective metrics for success. Since 2001, the U.S. government has made improving the lives of Afghan women and girls a priority. Big, big issue with Congress. And it has designated funding and implemented programming specifically designed to support this vulnerable group in Afghanistan. So we conducted an audit to determine whether or not the agencies could draw any correlation between our programs and reported outcomes. In other words, were our programs actually helping Afghan women? How do you measure that? Because the one thing you say touts all the time is how lives of women in Afghanistan have improved. Well, maybe they have. But maybe they have because more women have gone to the city. The war has impacted them, so they're out of the suburbs into the city getting better service. Or maybe our programs actually do have an impact. You'd want to know that, you would think, if you're going to ask for nearly $500 million for another program. If you're guessing that no comprehensive assessment was available to confirm that reported gains and improvements were the direct result of our efforts, you are correct. In fiscal years 2011 through 2013, DoD, state, and USAID together reported spending at least $65 million on 652 projects, programs, and initiatives to assist Afghan women and girls. Each of these agencies also reported gains and improvements in the status of Afghan women during the same period. However, our audit concluded that the specific impact of the agency's efforts was unclear. We cannot tell if what we're doing has helped. SIGAR's audit recommended that the agencies develop and implement mechanisms to track the number of projects, programs, and initiatives that support Afghan women, as well as the funding levels for these efforts. State and USAID, shockingly, did not concur with this recommendation, claiming that their existing mechanisms of just saying it were sufficient. Since USAID is reportedly satisfied with the mechanism in place to assess the impact of their current work to improve the lives of women and girls, despite their inability to draw any correlation between inputs and outputs, they are moving forward with Promote, using the same old mechanism for identifying outcomes. As you can imagine, SIGAR has serious concerns about this, considering the unprecedented investment in Promote. But it's not only SIGAR that has problems with this, it's the wife of the president of Afghanistan that has problems with this as well. Because she says, we don't need any more training programs, we don't need any more flyers, happy talk. What we need is programs that train Afghan women to do certain things. And she wants to make sure Promote will do that before it is implemented. We actually were able to get ahead of this program since it was just recently proposed and made some recommendations to improve it. So hopefully it'll work better than the others. Now, looking towards the future, let me close with a hopeful anecdote from our IG's recent trip to Afghanistan. President Ghani invited the IG to meet with him and his key advisors at the presidential palace. He thanked SIGAR for our aggressive oversight work, sharing that he personally reads, as I mentioned, and uses our reports. He seemed eager to ensure that the U.S. taxpayer funds are protected against waste, fraud, and abuse, and was open to the idea of conditioning assistance on the achievement of realistic and meaningful goals. That is, to quote Donald Trump, huge, that the Afghan government will condition assistance on the achievement of realistic and meaningful goals. Because now we have a willing partner in the Afghan government. Under Karzai, we did not. And it can be all too easy to forget that the reconstruction gains achieved since 2001 rely on the dedication of the Afghans to be sustained. In short, President Ghani presented himself as a willing partner, committed to attaining the long-term aims of our mission in Afghanistan. While SIGAR remains optimistic about this, we still will stand by our mantra, which is trust but verify. As you work on your projects for this class, I hope some of these lessons that SIGAR has learned over the years can help you avoid some of the pitfalls that are ever present in developing countries, as well as developed countries. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think that he was right on point with where we are in the class. We're talking about needs assessments, strategies, and remember I said before that the brother and the sister are proposals and evaluation. Everything that you said was something they should have had in the proposal to begin with, because people like Gene Alloys are going to come back and evaluate and say, did you do what you said you were supposed to do? So that's why it's so important that we articulate these things in the actual project itself. Go ahead, did you have a question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you both, first of all, so much for coming to speak to us today. We've been talking today about the importance of learning from our mistakes as well as our successes, and while you have not yet received the top 10 list in your work, have you come across a project or projects that have impressed you from an accountability perspective?
Yes. I would say one of the biggest successes has been the Afghan National Defense Forces. When we got there were none. And we have spent $65 billion to build one, and they do fight. And it's a tough slog they have going with them right now, because we are basically pulled out. We provide limited air support, but not much. And that is a success story. Health has improved in Afghanistan, but as one USAID official told me, it's gone from horrible to miserable, but it's been improved. Women's rights and women's issues has improved at least in Kabul. Who knows what it's like in the countryside? And I think every one of you in this room can guess, as soon as we withdraw, what's the likelihood that those gains are going to be sustained. We did find one other success story in Afghanistan. It was actually a health clinic. We inspected it. And in this health clinic, it was, number one, clean. Number two, fully staffed with doctors and nurses, providing prenatal care for women. It was staffed with, it was full of patients. People seemed to like it, seemed to want it. And we asked, how did this happen? This works. And they said, well, the Afghan villagers wanted a clinic, and they asked for this clinic. And the Afghan warlord who surrounded the area donated the land for the clinic. So it goes back to what I had mentioned. If one of the questions, do they want it and do they need it? And this is proof, if they do, they will sustain it and make it successful.
Other questions?
So I think it's mind-blowing, honestly, you know, how we can allocate so many U.S. taxpaying dollars to go towards projects and programs for reconstructive purposes that don't have those metrics front-ended, built into the project. Do you think there should, in the future, would you recommend that there's contingent design, basically, if you don't have those metrics built into whatever the contract allows for, that then therefore you cannot implement? So that I'm just wondering, it just seems like you guys continue to go, this is wrong, this is not helping, da 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 da. How can we front end that so that, because that's what we're learning about, is how to incorporate that, but at the same time I'm just wondering, instead of having two, you know, you have kind of your agency, then what are we learning and what can we do differently? It's like you know all of these lessons already, and do you think it would be helpful to then integrate that into the front end so that it's mandatory, so that you automatically have those kind of trackers in place so that you can look at that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have started what we're calling our Lessons Learned program in Cigar. And we hope that our reports, we're looking at counter-narcotics, we're looking at anti-corruption, we're looking at governance, we're looking at international coordination, we're looking at strategy and planning, and we've got other things we hope to look at. And we're going to make these short, pithy reports, because most lessons learned reports, if you're not familiar with them, are like this thick, and they sit on the shelf, and nobody reads them. We're trying to make this so it'll be readable and readily usable, forcible to the military, so they can incorporate it into their doctrine when they're training their future leaders. And I do the same kind of talk to the Naval Postgraduate School, to actually our people, as well as international students who are flag officers, and they're equally as appalled. So we hope through our Lessons Learned program we can get people to start putting this into doctrine, into training, so that they can figure it out from the beginning that they should have metrics and all of this ahead of time before they embark on this project.
A follow-up just thought on that is, I mean, it seems like you're trying, that in that effort, you're kind of trying to repair a system that's still broken. That at the end of the day, whatever the policy is or isn't in place that would therefore require this in order to ensure that it's not just up to the folks who will be designing these things or not designing them properly, but rather, you know, something legitimately cannot move forward if it doesn't have what you're talking about. So I guess it's just still, I'm glad that there is going to be this lessons learned document. I'm just wondering at what level would there need to be an official mandate that would require what you're, you know, basically recommending, so that we can all avoid things like this happening in the future.
You know, we can ask Congress to mandate this stuff, but in fact they actually have in certain programs, and it's been ignored. So our best thing is to try to change the culture, starting with people who are starting out in the field, officers starting out in the field. Look, one of the reasons this happened is because, for whatever reason, we spent too much money too fast in a country that couldn't absorb it. So USAID was, you know, empowered with all these dollars. The Defense Department was getting billions of dollars. State Department was getting millions of dollars. And they had, their metric was, have you spent the money by the end of the fiscal year? That's their metric. And so you come up with, let's buy, I got an idea, they need some airplanes, let's buy some G222 aircraft and bid, and bottom line, I mean, the story is much worse than that. I mean, we went to a junkyard in Italy, said, do you have any aircraft? And they pointed these out, we had to refurbish them to the tune of $500,000. And the refurbishment was bad, and they didn't fly, and they leaked fuel inside the cabin, and there were sparks from poor electrical. I mean, it was a total disaster. But the other thing we try in Cigar to do is hold people accountable for these decisions. And we're whistling in the wind. One of our reports looked at a building, we call it the 64K building, that was built for $36 million after the Marine General at the air base said, I don't want it, I don't need it, I won't use it, don't build it. And the Army contracting officer said, oh, thanks very much, but we're building it. So they built it. It's the best built building we've seen in Afghanistan, high tech, that we built. High tech, had a war room, had video monitors, had everything. It has never been used to this day. We gave it to the Afghans, who cut holes in the wall because they don't want air conditioning, they want fresh air, but we put an air conditioner system in it. It's just, I could stand here and go all day long giving you these examples, but I won't. But bottom line, too much money, too fast in a country that couldn't absorb it. So, to get to your question, even if we have this doctrine, even if people are educated and realize that what we did in Afghanistan was a disaster, can't do it again because we can't afford it. What happens when we go into Syria next time? And this, and the solution to the problem from our Congress is to throw money at it. And the agency have to spend the money by the end of the fiscal year. What do you think is going to happen? We didn't learn this lesson in Vietnam. We didn't learn this lesson in Iraq. Will we learn this lesson in Afghanistan? And, you know, our agency has 200 people, and we're screaming at the top of our lungs about this. So we'll see.
Any other questions? Here you go.
Yes.
With the CERT projects that you guys have done, is there any kind of like reconstruction that has happened to go back in with projects that do have the upfront metrics that they have tried to like take what they've done and make it more helpful for the communities at all? Does that ever happen? Just curious.
Not that I'm aware of.
There was a bridge that they did that with, but when they found the bridge was falling apart, and they repaired it.
So there was individual projects.
It was a small bridge.
Yeah, but
To get across, so they
yeah,
redid it.
you're right. They probably figured out we need this to drive our vehicles across. But like I said, a lot of that money was first used by the military when they first got there to buy loyalty. and they didn't really care what you were building with it. And half of it probably got stolen to begin with. I mean, they literally went with pallets of cash to Afghanistan. And we're dealing this out in cash. So, I mean, where's the accountability with that? But they were fighting a war, and it's a weapon of war, basically. So, but, you know, what the other thing we found is that not only was it too much money too fast in a country that couldn't absorb it, it actually worked against the mission. Because the Afghan people are not stupid. They hear that we've spent $110 billion, and they're like, so where are our roads? Where's our electricity? Where's our clean water? Where did the $110 billion go? We know where it went. And we went into corrupt officials' pockets. So that turns them against us because they think we're idiots, which we've proven to be in some cases.
Any other questions? Well, yeah, everything you've shared with us is almost a reason for why government shouldn't be in this business. I mean, it seems to be a commercial against the role of government and increased government action. And so I just wonder, what do you say to that, or how do you struggle with that inside yourself? Why, I could be completely pessimistic about the whole idea of government aid action.
The one responsibility of government that I think even the right wing will agree with is national security. And this was a national security issue. And winning the war, part of winning the war was reconstruction of Afghanistan. Because the idea, as I mentioned, was that it never again be a haven for terrorists. And reconstruction money was supposed to be used. I mean, well, let's face it, I don't mean to be insulting, but it's a medieval society. And when we went in there, you know, we go in and inspect the buildings that were built that were really poorly built, but there were no buildings before we went in. There were literally no ministries for the government. There were no buildings for the government. I mean, there was nothing, and we built all of that. Now you could question, was that a right strategy? Because Afghanistan never successfully had a central government. It was always local, tribal. So maybe we did the whole strategy wrong. Who knows? It remains to be seen. But it wasn't the government that was building these facilities. It was private industry that we were contracting with, the dying corps of the world, you know, the Lockheed Martins. But there was just such poor oversight of what they were doing that we ended up with this mess. So I would say it is a government function. National security is what the government has to provide to its people. And Afghanistan was, in our view, a national security matter. So that's why they undertake this. And I think they'll do the same thing in Syria, I'm sure.
You mentioned that Karzai was harder to work with, or was less of a partner.
Right.
How so? Do you mind sharing?
Well, and this is anecdotal. In the beginning of his term, I think we handled him badly. I think we've insulted him. I've talked to people who are personal friends with him, and you know, during his re-election campaign, we were supporting a different candidate. Some people in our government, and he never, as you might imagine, got over that. And someone said to me that the only thing he wants is an apology from us for treating him so poorly, and he never got it. So he basically turned against us. He was difficult to work with. He wouldn't sign the status of forces agreement. You know, he complained every military action we took, he complained publicly in the newspapers about it. Part of that was our fault, and part of it is he's a strange character to begin with. So it's not a good combination.
So it's a it's domestic political considerations.
Well, we need to end. We could go on. There'd be a lot of questions, but let's give Gene a round of applause. And have a good week. We got assignments and things to do, and places to go. So,
Thank you. Good luck.